There was a time when treating your spouse with dignity and respect was considered the foundation of a strong marriage. When standing before the world and honoring the person you chose to spend your life with was not just expected, but required. But what happened on Family Feud one Thursday evening in December 2024 would expose a level of disrespect so shocking that even Steve Harvey, a man who had seen everything in his decades of television, could barely believe what he was witnessing. When a husband began publicly insulting his wife on national television, Steve Harvey did not just respond with words. He responded with a silence so powerful that it spoke louder than anything he could have said. If you believe that marriage deserves respect and that no one should tolerate being humiliated by their partner, make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel, because what you are about to witness will remind you why dignity matters more than anything. The Family Feud stage was set. The cameras were ready. Two families stood at their podiums prepared to compete for prize money and the chance to prove they knew what survey respondents were thinking. But one contestant, 35-year-old Brian Matthews from Florida, was about to reveal a side of himself so cruel and thoughtless that it would leave everyone in the studio horrified and prove that some people should never be given a microphone. Brian Matthews was the kind of man who thought he was funnier than he actually was. He worked as a car salesman at a dealership in Tampa, and he had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment and the cutting joke disguised as humor. At 35 years old, Brian believed that being able to make people laugh meant he could say whatever he wanted, regardless of who it hurt. He had grown up watching comedy roasts and stand-up specials where comedians insulted each other, and he had somehow convinced himself that this was an acceptable way to treat everyone in his life, including his wife. Standing next to Brian was his wife of 8 years, Nicole Matthews. She was 32 years old, a kindergarten teacher with a warm smile that had become increasingly strained over the years. Nicole was naturally beautiful, though she had struggled with her weight after having their 2 children. She was self-conscious about the extra pounds she carried, about the stretch marks that mapped her body, about the fact that she no longer looked like the woman Brian had married 8 years ago. What the audience did not know was that Brian made jokes about Nicole's appearance constantly. At family gatherings, he would introduce her as his wife, and then make a comment about how marriage had changed her. At restaurants, he would joke about how much she ate. At home, he would compare her to other women and point out all the ways she had let herself go. Nicole had asked him countless times to stop, had told him that his words hurt her, had begged him to show her some kindness, but Brian always defended himself the same way. He was just joking. She was too sensitive. She could not take a joke. If she lost weight, he would not have material. Nicole had grown up in a loving home where her parents treated each other with respect and affection. Her father had never made cruel jokes about her mother. Her mother had never tolerated being disrespected. Nicole had thought Brian would mature, that he would eventually understand that words have power, that humor at someone else's expense is not really humor at all. But 8 years into their marriage, Brian had only gotten worse. Their children, 6-year-old Mason and 4-year-old Olivia, sat in the audience with Nicole's parents. Nicole's mother had been vocal about her concerns regarding Brian's treatment of her daughter. She had witnessed the jokes, seen the pain in Nicole's eyes, watched her daughter's confidence erode under the constant criticism disguised as humor. She had encouraged Nicole to stand up for herself, to demand better treatment, to consider whether this marriage was truly what she wanted. The Matthews family had made it onto Family Feud after multiple attempts to apply. Brian had been excited about the opportunity, seeing it as a chance to showcase his humor to a national audience. Nicole had been hesitant, worried about what Brian might say on television, but she had agreed because she wanted to support her family. She had no idea that this appearance would become the moment that changed everything. The game began with the usual energy and excitement. Steve Harvey introduced both families, and the competition started. The Matthews family was doing well, answering questions correctly and building up points. Steve went through his standard routine, engaging with the contestants and delivering his characteristic humor. Then came the moment that would change the tone of the entire taping. Steve Harvey asked a survey question that was meant to be light-hearted and fun. The question was simple and innocent, designed to get amusing answers and create entertaining television. Steve looked at Brian and asked, "Name something a husband might hide from his wife." Brian buzzed in with confidence. He had a big smile on his face, clearly pleased with the answer he was about to give. "Her scale," he said loudly, then turned to Nicole. "Because my wife does not need any more bad news when she steps on that thing." He laughed at his own joke. The studio audience gave an uncomfortable, scattered laugh. A few people gasped. Nicole's face turned bright red, and she looked down at the podium, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Steve Harvey's smile disappeared instantly. He stared at Brian with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between disbelief and disgust. "What did you just say?" Steve asked, his voice flat. Brian, oblivious to the fact that he had crossed a line, repeated his answer. "Her scale. You know, because she has gained some weight since we got married. It is just a joke, Steve. She knows I am playing." Steve Harvey did not respond immediately. Instead, he simply stared at Brian. The silence stretched out, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. The production crew was uncertain about what to do. The audience was completely quiet. Nicole stood at her podium with tears forming in her eyes. Finally, Steve spoke. His voice was measured and controlled, but there was an edge to it that everyone in the studio could hear. "That was your answer. You just insulted your wife on national television, and you thought that was funny." Brian's smile faltered slightly. "Come on, Steve, it is just a joke. You make jokes about marriage all the time." "I make jokes with my wife," Steve said firmly. "I do not make jokes at my wife. There is a difference, and if you do not know the difference, then you have a serious problem." Steve looked at the board. "Scale" was not even on the board as an answer. "Not on the board," Steve announced. But he was not ready to move on. He turned back to Brian. "Let me ask you something. Do you think your wife enjoyed that joke?" Brian glanced at Nicole, who was clearly trying not to cry. "She is fine. She knows I am just playing around." "Does she look fine to you?" Steve asked, gesturing toward Nicole. "Because from where I am standing, she looks humiliated." The game continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The energy that had been fun and light-hearted was now tense and uncomfortable. A few questions later, it was Brian's turn again. Steve asked another survey question, this time about what husbands appreciate most about their wives. Brian buzzed in. "Their cooking," he said. Then he added, "Which is ironic because my wife is a terrible cook. But at least she tries, right?" He laughed again, looking around for others to join in. This time, no one laughed. The audience sat in stunned silence. Nicole's tears were flowing freely now, and she made no attempt to hide them. Steve Harvey put his cards down and walked directly to Brian. The look on Steve's face was one that no one in that studio would ever forget. "We need to stop," Steve said to the production crew. Then he addressed Brian directly. "You have insulted your wife twice now in the span of 5 minutes. You have made jokes about her weight and her cooking on national television. And you seem to think this is acceptable behavior." Brian tried to defend himself. "Steve, I am just trying to be entertaining. This is a comedy show, right?" "This is a game show," Steve corrected. "And even if it was a comedy show, there is nothing funny about humiliating your wife. There is nothing entertaining about making the person who gave you children, who stands by your side, who chose to build a life with you feel small and worthless." Steve turned to Nicole. "Mom, how long has he been talking to you like this?" Nicole wiped her tears and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Since I had our first child 6 years ago. Since my body changed. Since I stopped looking the way he wanted me to look." The studio was absolutely silent. Even the crew members had stopped working to listen. What was unfolding was not entertainment. It was a marriage in crisis, exposed for the world to see. Steve Harvey looked at Nicole with genuine compassion. 6 years, he repeated. 6 years of being insulted by the man who is supposed to love you more than anyone else in the world. 6 years of being made to feel like you are not good enough. He turned back to Brian, and his expression hardened. "Let me tell you something about real men. Real men do not insult their wives. Real men do not make jokes at the expense of the woman who gave birth to their children. Real men do not humiliate their partners for entertainment. Brian tried to interrupt, but Steve raised his hand. No. You have had your turn to talk, and you used it to insult your wife. Now you are going to listen. Steve addressed the audience and the cameras. I want everyone watching to understand something. What you just witnessed is not humor. It is cruelty. When someone uses the word joke to disguise insults, that is emotional abuse. When someone repeatedly tears down their partner and then tells them they are too sensitive for being hurt, that is manipulation. He looked directly at Brian. Your wife had 2 children. Her body changed because she grew human beings inside of her. She created life. And instead of honoring that, instead of appreciating the sacrifice she made, you mock her. You insult her. You make her feel like she should be ashamed of the very thing that gave you your family. Brian's face had gone pale. For the first time he seemed to realize that the situation was serious. I did not mean it like that, he said weakly. Then how did you mean it? Steve challenged. Explain to me how insulting your wife's weight and her cooking is supposed to be interpreted as anything other than disrespect. Brian had no answer. He stood silently, apparently unable to defend his behavior when confronted directly. Steve turned back to Nicole. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Not for him, not for the cameras, but for yourself. Do you feel respected in your marriage? Nicole shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, she said. I do not feel respected. I have not felt respected in years. Has he ever made you feel beautiful? Steve asked gently. Not since before we got married, Nicole admitted. Everything changed after our wedding. He started making comments about my appearance. Small things at first, then bigger things. Now he makes jokes about me in front of our friends, our family, and apparently on national television. The audience was visibly moved. Several women were crying. Even some of the men looked angry on Nicole's behalf. Steve looked at Brian with an expression that combined disappointment and anger. Do you understand what you have done to this woman? Do you understand that you have spent 6 years destroying her self-esteem, making her doubt herself, making her feel like she is not worthy of love and respect? Brian's eyes were filling with tears now. I just thought I was being funny, he said, his voice cracking. At whose expense? Steve demanded. You thought you were being funny at the expense of the woman who loves you. You thought entertainment was more important than her feelings. You thought making other people laugh was worth making your wife cry. Steve paused, then continued with a softer but still firm tone. Your children are sitting in that audience right now. They are watching their father insult their mother on television. What do you think you are teaching them? You are teaching your son that it is acceptable to disrespect women. You are teaching your daughter that she should accept being treated this way by her future partner. Is that the legacy you want to leave? Brian looked toward the audience where his children sat. Mason and Olivia were with their grandmother, who had her arms around them protectively. The look on their faces was confusion and sadness. Nicole spoke up, her voice stronger now. I have asked him to stop for years. I have told him that his jokes hurt me. I have begged him to treat me with kindness. But he always says the same thing, that I am too sensitive, that I cannot take a joke, that I need to lighten up. But I am not too sensitive. His words are too cruel. The audience applauded Nicole's words. Steve nodded in agreement. You are absolutely right. You are not too sensitive. Words have power. Words can build people up or tear them down. And for 6 years, your husband has been using words to tear you down. Steve looked at Brian. I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you love your wife? Yes, Brian said immediately. Yes, I love her. Then why do you treat her like you do not? Steve asked. Why do you insult the woman you claim to love? Why do you make her feel worthless? Brian looked at Nicole, really looked at her, and saw the pain in her eyes. He saw the damage his words had caused. And for the first time, he seemed to truly understand what he had been doing. I do not know, he said quietly. I honestly do not know. I thought I was just being funny. I did not realize how much I was hurting her. That is not good enough, Steve said firmly. She told you. She asked you to stop. She made it clear that your words were hurting her. You knew. You just did not care enough to change. The truth of those words seemed to hit Brian like a physical blow. He looked devastated. You are right, he said. I knew. She told me. And I did not listen. I did not change. I was selfish and cruel. He turned to Nicole. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. You did not deserve any of that. You gave me everything and I repaid you by making you feel terrible about yourself. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. The studio was filled with the sound of Nicole crying and Brian apologizing. Steve Harvey let the moment happen, understanding that sometimes public accountability is the catalyst for private change. After a moment, Steve spoke again. Brian, an apology is a start. But it is only a start. The real work comes next. You need to understand why you thought it was acceptable to treat your wife this way. You need to learn how to show respect and appreciation. You need to rebuild the trust and self-esteem that you have spent years destroying. He turned to Nicole. And you need to decide whether you can forgive him. Whether you want to give him the chance to change. Whether this marriage is worth saving. Because you deserve to be treated with love and respect. And if he cannot give you that, then you deserve to find someone who can. Nicole looked at her husband, then at Steve, then out at the audience where her children sat. I want my marriage to work, she said. But not like this. Never like this again. If Brian wants to save this marriage, he needs to show me through his actions that he respects me. Words are not enough anymore. Steve nodded approvingly. That is exactly right. Actions speak louder than words. And Brian, you need to understand that your wife just gave you an opportunity that you do not deserve. She is giving you a chance to become the husband she needs. Do not waste it. Steve announced that he would be connecting the Matthews family with marriage counselors and individual therapists. He made it clear that this was not about finishing a game show. This was about saving a family. The taping ended, but the real work was just beginning. Brian and Nicole began intensive therapy, both individually and as a couple. Brian had to confront the fact that his behavior constituted emotional abuse. He had to examine why he felt the need to tear down his wife, why he prioritized getting laughs over her feelings, why he had ignored her pain for so many years. Nicole attended therapy to work on rebuilding her self-esteem and setting firm boundaries. She learned that she had the right to demand respect, that she was not too sensitive, that her feelings mattered. She started exercising not to meet Brian's standards, but because it made her feel strong and healthy. She discovered that she was beautiful exactly as she was. When the episode aired 3 months later, the response was overwhelming. The clip of Steve Harvey confronting Brian went viral within hours, generating millions of views and sparking intense conversations about emotional abuse in marriage. The moment when Steve simply stared at Brian in silence became one of the most powerful and talked about moments in game show history. Women from around the world reached out to share their own stories of being insulted and belittled by their partners. Men contacted the show to say that watching the episode had made them realize they had been treating their wives disrespectfully. Therapists reported an increase in couples seeking help for verbal abuse issues. The phrase, "It is just a joke," became a rallying point for conversations about how humor is used to disguise cruelty. Social media was filled with discussions about the difference between laughing with someone and laughing at someone, about how words have consequences, about how love should never look like insults. 7 months after the original taping, Family Feud invited the Matthews family back for a follow-up segment. The transformation was visible the moment they walked onto the stage. Nicole carried herself differently. She stood taller, smiled more genuinely, and radiated a confidence that had been missing before. Brian looked humbled and sincere. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by a genuine humility. When Steve Harvey asked them to share what had happened since the original episode, both of them spoke with honesty and vulnerability. Brian spoke first. "Mr. Harvey, you changed my life that day. You held up a mirror and forced me to see what I had become. I was emotionally abusive to my wife. I hid behind the excuse of humor, but the truth is, I was cruel. I have spent the last 7 months in therapy working to understand why I felt the need to tear down the woman I love." He turned to Nicole. "I have learned that my words were not jokes. They were weapons. and I used them against you for years. I am deeply ashamed of that. I am working every single day to become the husband you deserve." Nicole spoke next. "The therapy has been life-changing for me too. I learned that I had the right to demand respect. I learned that setting boundaries is not being difficult. I learned that I am worthy of love and kindness exactly as I am. Brian has done the work. He has shown me through his actions that he is committed to change. He has not made a single insulting joke in 7 months. He builds me up instead of tearing me down." Steve smiled, clearly pleased with their progress. That is what real change looks like. It is not easy. It is not quick. But it is possible when both people commit to doing the work. The follow-up segment included video footage from their home life. Brian was shown helping Nicole in the kitchen, praising her cooking, and expressing genuine appreciation. Nicole was shown pursuing her interests, setting boundaries, and being treated with respect. Their children were shown in a home environment that was healthier and happier than before. Nicole's mother appeared in the segment, tears of joy in her eyes. "I have my daughter back," she said. "The confident, happy woman she used to be is returning, and Brian has become the son-in-law I always hoped he would be." Steve used the follow-up segment to announce a new initiative called Words Matter, Ending Verbal Abuse in Relationships. The program would provide resources, counseling, and education about the impact of verbal abuse and how to build respectful partnerships. The Matthews family became advocates for relationship respect. Brian began speaking at men's groups about the damage caused by insulting your partner. He was unflinchingly honest about his past behavior and the work required to change. His willingness to be vulnerable helped other men recognize and address their own patterns of disrespect. Nicole volunteered with women's support groups, sharing her story and helping others recognize emotional abuse. She emphasized that abuse does not always look like physical violence, that words can be just as damaging as fists, that humor used as a weapon is still a weapon. The episode became a teaching tool in therapy programs, communication courses, and relationship education seminars. Mental health professionals used it to help clients identify verbal abuse patterns. Schools incorporated it into programs teaching young people about healthy relationships. One of the most significant impacts was the conversation it sparked about body image and postpartum changes. Thousands of women shared their experiences of being made to feel ashamed of their bodies after having children. The episode helped normalize the physical changes that come with pregnancy and motherhood, and it challenged the expectation that women should look the same after creating life. 2 years after the original episode, the Matthews family returned to Family Feud for a special anniversary segment. They brought their children, now 8-year-old Mason and 6-year-old Olivia, who spoke about how their home life had improved. Mason said that his father had apologized to him for setting a bad example and had talked to him about treating women with respect. Olivia said that her mother was happy now and that their house felt peaceful. The children's testimonials were powerful reminders that children absorb everything and that changing destructive patterns benefits the entire family. Steve Harvey reflected on the experience in interviews and public appearances. "That moment when I just stared at Brian, when I could not even find words, that was genuine," he said. "I was shocked that someone would insult their wife so casually, so publicly, so carelessly. But I am proud that we used that moment to create change, to start conversations, to help people recognize that words matter." Brian wrote a public letter that was published in several major media outlets. In it, he detailed his journey from being someone who insulted his wife for laughs to becoming a man who understood the power and responsibility of his words. The letter went viral and prompted thousands of responses from people sharing their own stories of change and growth. Nicole published an essay about reclaiming her self-worth and refusing to accept disrespect. Her words resonated with millions of women who saw themselves in her story. She became a sought-after speaker on topics of self-esteem, boundary setting, and recognizing emotional abuse. 3 years after the episode aired, researchers conducted studies on its impact and found that it had measurably increased awareness of verbal abuse in relationships. Surveys showed that people who watched the episode were more likely to recognize insulting behavior as unacceptable and more likely to speak up when they witnessed it. The Matthews marriage continued to thrive based on mutual respect and appreciation. Brian had completely changed his communication style, learning to express affection and admiration rather than criticism and insults. Nicole had fully reclaimed her confidence and self-worth, refusing to tolerate any return to old patterns. Their relationship became a model not of perfection, but of redemption. They showed that people can change, that marriages can heal, that respect can be learned, and that accountability is the first step toward transformation. The moment when Steve Harvey stared in silence at a husband who had just insulted his wife became more than a viral clip. It became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that silence can be powerful, that witnesses have a responsibility to speak up, and that no one should tolerate being treated with disrespect by the person who is supposed to love them most. Years later, when Brian and Nicole renewed their vows, they wrote promises that reflected their transformed relationship. Brian vowed to honor Nicole with his words as well as his actions, to build her up rather than tear her down, to appreciate the sacrifices she had made. Nicole vowed to maintain her boundaries, to demand the respect she deserved, and to never again accept being diminished. The ceremony was attended by couples they had helped through their advocacy work, therapists they had partnered with, and the production team from Family Feud who had witnessed their transformation from the beginning. Steve Harvey sent a video message congratulating them and reminding them that their story had changed countless lives. If this story opened your eyes to the power of words, if it reminded you that insults disguised as jokes are still insults, if it showed you that respect is not optional in marriage, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Share this message with someone who needs to hear it today. Because words matter. The way we speak to our partners matters. Love should sound like appreciation and kindness, not criticism and mockery. Real humor lifts people up, it does not tear them down. And the strongest marriages are built on mutual respect, not on one person being the punchline of cruel jokes. That is the kind of love worth building. That is the kind of partnership worth fighting for. That is the legacy we should all be working to create.